Welcome back, Social 20-1, Lesson 21, Part 3. We're going to be looking at an assortment of different organizations here today. We have NATO and NORAD and the UN. Some of these you may remember from Social 10, maybe you do not. We have an extended look here, an extended YouTube video about peacekeeping and peacemaking to wrap up yesterday's or last class's look at the UN. That's some enrichment activity there for you if you need to look at it as you distinguish between peacekeeping and peacemaking. We also have some practice multiple choice questions here as well to help you further understand the application of this content. We have some additional articles about the failures of peacekeeping as well. Jumping into these other international organizations. One that we can look at is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Put simply, this is a military alliance based upon collective security, meaning an attack on one is an attack on all. Key to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is it was created in 1949 as a defensive umbrella against the forces of the Soviet Union and her growing allies in Eastern Europe. Many of the individual countries, maybe all of them including America on their own, felt that they might not be a match for the conventional and soon-to-be nuclear threat that was the Soviet Union. So the idea was that as an alliance, as a group, they could have a defensive wall against the aggression, the expansion of the Soviets. We have a nice little video there for you to look at how powerful NATO is. Of course, NATO is still conversational today, still relevant with the new round of tension with Russia. As we've also seen with NATO, NATO has expanded, and this has been seen as a threat to Russia, as NATO has been expanding towards Russian borders. And with the 2022 invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there's an increased desire for other countries to consider joining NATO. Ukraine was not a part of NATO at the time of the invasion, therefore NATO didn't directly come to the aid of Ukraine. But the message was sent clear to Moscow: Poland is a part of NATO. The Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, are parts of NATO, and therefore you must stay out. Here's the spending as a percentage of GDP on their military. When Trump was president of the United States, he wanted more from his allies, and this would echo that 2% is the target. Canada was doing about half of that. So Canada, based upon what President Trump had wanted from America's allies and NATO's, Canada needed to do twice as much. Germany needed to do more. Italy needed to do more. France was nearly doing enough. The UK was doing more than enough. But America, even though it has the biggest GDP, was spending proportionally as well more than the others. Is NATO still relevant? Well, unfortunately, with the invasion of Ukraine, we found yes, it definitely is. So this article came out before that. Most Americans do think NATO should be maintained, and again, this was before the invasion. This was before the invasion of Ukraine, so I'm assuming that these numbers are only going to go up. This is a critique of NATO. Potentially, the cartoonist is trying to expose the fact that NATO isn't about defending democracy just as much as it is about defending government. Bureaucracy. Here it's a criticism of Germany providing too little, too late, whereas NATO has toppled, in this case it's the ex-Libyan leader Colonel Gaddafi, And the Americans were there, the French were there, the British were there, the Germans not so much. They got lost in the desert. Here, NATO is criticized for being involved in Kosovo. So here, Germany is being criticized for not doing enough. Here, NATO's criticized for doing too much, and potentially some of their smart bombs hit the wrong targets in the war in Kosovo. NATO's one of those things that they're guilty of missteps as much as they're guilty of, or should be praised for being the weapon, being the tool, being the shield that nations need. So sometimes it appears that American foreign policy is condemned to criticism. Whether they act or don't act, there's always going to be critics of what they decide to do. Here's some of that criticism in Libya. Before the American-led NATO intervention in Libya, as a response to the civil war there, Libya was a wealthy, prosperous African nation, among the richest in Africa, and then 5 years on, 1 in 3 Libyans live in poverty. Interesting contrast. That contrast is continued here, contrast is continued here, contrast is continued there. So next up, after you feel comfortable that you understand what NATO is and how it has been condemned for some missteps, but also it's very relevant in places like Ukraine. Next up, you can go to the EU. Again, a topic, a study that you've looked at in Social 10 with the EU. There's a quick video to get you caught back up if you don't remember much about the EU. And there's some other quick videos you can look at. Now, within the EU, we saw Brexit. The British were part of the EU, and they decided to exit the EU. So you can make the conclusion that the path to supranationalism, if the EU is the closest that we've come to supranationalism, then the path is not linear and it's not without its bumps. We can see that there are times when nationalism, once again, is seen to be more important than supranationalism. This cartoon is saying it didn't really matter. Europe was still, suffering some issues with or without the British. This cartoon is suggesting as the British are leaving and they slam the door, it is going to help crumble the EU. This one is suggesting that for the British, there's no difference between a hard or soft landing, that the British will suffer. The British will suffer when they exit the EU. The EU will suffer. We have different perspectives here. Here we have the British abandoning ship and maybe potentially getting away from the debt and the sinking ship that is the EU. Some of the weapons here, some of the monsters are things like political correctness, economic failure, taxes, debt. These are issues that they're not able to work with. This was some evidence about that Brexit decision. You can see that the vote to leave looked like they were going to lose the referendum. And then on referendum day, they just spiked at the right time, and then they voted to leave. And since then, when polled, the majority of Brits want to remain, but the decision's been made. And that's kind of a map of the UK. And you can see that the Scots wanted to remain, much of the Welsh wanted to remain, but it was the English, the Anglos, that really wanted to leave. And there's some ideas of, is it good or bad to leave the EU? Maybe read that over, because this gives you a case for and against supranationalism. By looking at the EU and the Brexit, we can look at supranationalism. To what extent, under what circumstances might one pick nationalism over supranationalism? Well, why would somebody pick exiting the EU? We also have an update on NAFTA, the USMCA, the United States, Mexico, Canada trade agreement. So take a peek at that article, see what's happening with the most important economic agreement that Canada is a part of. And I think we'll create a different video on the international war on terror.